The alarms were already screaming when I opened my eyes. Red light pulsed across the ceiling of my quarters, and the deck beneath me shook with a force that told me we were under fire before any voice confirmed it. I was on my feet and moving before I had finished waking up. Years of training do that to a person. The body moves while the mind is still catching up. "Hull breach on deck 4, the ship's voice announced. "All hands to combat stations." I grabbed my armor from the rack beside my bed and pulled it on piece by piece, the way I had done 1,000 times before. Chest plate first, then the shoulder guards, then the gauntlets that always felt too heavy in the first few seconds, and then disappeared into muscle memory. My name is Daniel Voss, and I am the only human serving aboard the Ashvale, a warship that belongs to the Keth Alliance, a coalition of species that decided, a long time ago, that humanity was useful enough to keep around, but never worth trusting completely. I did not choose this life because I wanted glory. I chose it because after the war that nearly ended my planet, there was nothing left at home that felt like a future. The Alliance offered training, purpose, and a paycheck that meant my mother would never have to worry about rationed food again. I signed the contract without reading every line. I do not regret it, even now. But I have learned things about myself in that uniform that I never expected to learn, and some of them were hard to accept. I ran down the corridor toward the lower gunnery deck, boots slamming against metal, other crew members flattening themselves against the walls to let me pass. That was normal. On the Ashvale, humans were fast. Faster than the Keth, faster than the Dorun, faster than almost every species aboard except the Ilvath, and even they respected the speed at which we moved when something was on fire. "Voss, report." The voice belonged to Commander Sialith Korin, second in command of tactical operations, a Keth officer with pale blue skin and eyes like frozen glass. She was decent to me, in her own quiet way, not warm, but fair. I liked serving under her. "On my way to Gunnery 3, I said into my comm. "Structural damage report says we lost pressure in the starboard corridor. Get it sealed. We have incoming fighters, and Admiral Threll wants every gun online in the next 90 seconds. Admiral Threll. Hearing her name sent a small, familiar tightness through my chest. She commanded the Ashvale with absolute authority, and she was, without question, one of the most brilliant tacticians in the entire Alliance fleet. She was also the reason I sometimes lay awake at night wondering if 7 years of service had actually meant anything at all. I reached Gunnery 3 and found the console half-fried, sparks spitting from a shattered panel. Ensign Toma Reyes was already there, hands moving fast over the emergency backup controls. Toma was young, barely out of training, and this was her first real engagement. "Voss, thank the stars," she said. "I can't get the targeting array to reboot. Move over." I dropped into the seat beside her and started stripping the burned wiring away with my bare hands, ignoring the heat, splicing new connections the way I had learned during the war back home, back when we had no fancy diagnostic tools and only had our hands and our instincts. The panel flickered, died, then came back to life with a soft hum. "There," I said. "Targeting is back. Get me a firing solution on whatever is trying to kill us." Through the viewport, 3 enemy fighters cut across the black, weaving between debris that used to be part of our outer hull plating. They belonged to the Voss Compact, a rival faction that had been probing Alliance borders for months, testing our defenses, looking for weakness. This was not a full invasion, it was a message, and someone had decided the Ashvale would be the one to deliver it. "Firing solution locked," Toma said, voice tight with nerves. "Then fire." The guns roared. I felt the recoil through the deck, plating beneath my boots, that strange vibration that always made my teeth ache slightly. One of the enemy fighters spun away, trailing smoke, but the other 2 banked hard and came in low, aiming for the breach we had not yet sealed. "They're going for the hole in the hull," I said. "If they get a missile through there, it goes straight into the reactor corridor." Toma's hands froze over the console. Just for a second. But I saw it, and I knew what it meant. She was young, and this was not a drill anymore, and her body had just realized that people around her could actually die today. Reyes, look at me. She looked at me. You have got this. Fire when I call it. I climbed into the auxiliary hatch beside the console, the one that led out toward the exposed section of hull, grabbing a portable welding unit and an emergency patch kit as I went. This was not standard procedure. This was not something gunnery crew were trained to do. But someone had to close that breach before a missile turned the entire lower deck into a debris field, and there was no one else close enough. Voss, what are you doing? Commander Corrin's voice crackled through my comm. Sealing the breach myself. No time to wait for engineering. That's outside a safety perimeter, with hostiles still active. Belay that. I did not answer her. I am not proud of ignoring a direct order, but there are moments when a person has to choose between what is correct on paper and what is correct for the people standing beside you. I crawled out into the narrow access corridor, vacuum suit sealing tight around me, stars visible through the jagged tear in the hull, and I began welding the emergency patch into place with hands that did not shake, even though every part of me knew a stray shot could end things in an instant. 2 fighters screamed past, close enough that I felt the heat of their engines through my suit. I kept welding, the patch sealed. Pressure alarms went silent. Breach sealed, I said. Fire when ready, Reyes. The guns thundered behind me. I turned in time to see the final 2 fighters break apart in twin flashes of light, debris scattering harmlessly into the void. Silence followed, the kind of silence that only comes after violence has stopped, heavy and strange. I crawled back inside, sealed the hatch, and pulled my helmet off. My hands were shaking now, finally, now that there was nothing left to do but feel what had just happened. Toma stared at me like I had grown a second head. You just went outside during an active engagement, with your hands, to weld a hole shut. It worked. You're insane. Maybe, I said, but we're alive. We reported to the bridge an hour later, once the ship had stabilized and the last of the enemy fighters had either fled or been destroyed. Admiral Threll stood at the center of the command deck, tall, even by Keth standards, her dark armor immaculate despite the chaos that had just torn through her ship. She did not look at me the way she looked at her other officers. She never had. Casualties? She asked her staff. None, Admiral, Commander Corrin answered. Minimal injuries. Hull breach on Deck 4 was sealed manually before it could compromise the reactor corridor. Manually. Threll's eyes moved toward me for the first time. By whom? Sergeant Voss, Admiral. Something flickered across her face. Not gratitude, not quite anything I could name. She studied me the way someone studies a piece of equipment that performed unexpectedly well, filing the information away for later use, rather than offering any acknowledgement that a person had just risked his life for her ship. Efficient, she said finally, and turned back to her tactical display, already moving on to the next problem. That was the entire exchange. Efficient. Not thank you. Not well done. Just a single word, delivered the way a farmer might comment on a tool that had not broken. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself this many times over the years, every time she dismissed something I had done, every time my name was left out of a report while others received recognition for work I had carried on my back. I told myself that humans were new to this alliance, that trust took time, that respect was something earned slowly across generations rather than in a single tour of duty. I believed it, mostly because believing it was easier than accepting the alternative. But that night, lying in my quarters with the adrenaline finally draining out of my body, staring at the ceiling while the ship hummed quietly around me, I found myself thinking about home, about my mother, who used to tell me that a person's worth was never something you had to prove to people who had already decided not to see it. I had laughed it off back then. I was young, and I wanted so badly to belong to something larger than myself. I did not know it yet, lying there in the dark, but the words that would finally break something inside me were only a few weeks away. And when they came, they would not come from an enemy fighter or a hull breach or anything I could weld shut with my own two hands. They would come from her. 3 weeks passed before the next real crisis found us, and when it did, it came wearing the shape of an ambush no one saw until it was almost too late. We were escorting a convoy of supply vessels through the Varen corridor, a narrow band of space wedged between two hostile territories, the kind of place where nothing good ever happens, and everyone knows it. Admiral Threll had argued against taking this route during the planning session, but the Alliance Council overruled her, insisting the corridor was the fastest path and the risk was acceptable. I was not in that meeting. I only heard about the argument afterward, from Commander Corrin, who mentioned it with the particular weariness of someone who had watched her superior lose a fight she knew she was right about. I was stationed in the forward observation post when the first warning came through, a soft chime that most people would have missed entirely. I did not miss it. 7 years of paying attention to small details had trained that instinct into me so deeply it no longer felt like effort. "Commander, I'm reading gravitational distortion off the port bow. Small, but it's growing." Corrin's voice came back sharp. "Distortion from what?" "I don't know yet. It could be a cloaked field generator. It could be nothing, but it's growing fast." I watched the readings climb, and something cold settled into my stomach, the specific kind of dread that comes from recognizing a pattern before you have proof of what it means. I had seen distortions like this before, back during the war, right before an ambush sprung from nowhere and swallowed an entire formation whole. "Admiral," I said, switching channels directly to the bridge, breaking protocol because protocol felt too slow. "This isn't a sensor glitch. Someone is powering up a mass driver array inside a cloaking field. If I'm right, they're targeting the convoy, not us." There was a pause, a long one. I could imagine her standing on the bridge, weighing my words against everything she already believed about what a human sergeant was capable of understanding. "Explain your reasoning, Sergeant." I did, quickly, laying out the pattern I recognized, the specific signature of the distortion, the timing that matched exactly how these ambushes had worked during the war on my homeworld. I heard myself speaking fast, too fast maybe, urgency bleeding into every word, because every second we spent debating was a second the convoy did not have. "Sergeant Voss believes we are seconds from an ambush," Threll said finally, her voice carrying across the open channel to the rest of the bridge crew. "Helm, adjust course, put the ash veil between the convoy and the distortion field." The ship banked hard. I felt the deck tilt beneath me as the ash veil surged forward, placing its own hull directly into the path of whatever was about to happen. And then the mass driver fired. The impact was unlike anything I had felt before, a shudder that traveled through every deck of the ship simultaneously, alarms screaming from a dozen different systems at once. The cloaked platform had been real. My instincts had been correct. But the ash veil had taken the hit meant for 3 unarmed supply vessels, and now we were the ones bleeding. "Report." Threll's voice cut through the chaos. "Shields at 40%. Hull breach on decks 6 and 7. Reactor 2 is destabilizing. Get me eyes on that platform. I want it destroyed before it can fire again." I was already moving, pulling myself toward the nearest access corridor, because I knew something the tactical display did not yet show. The mass driver needed almost 90 seconds to recharge between shots, which meant we had a narrow window to strike back before it could kill anyone else. But our main gunnery array had taken damage in the first impact, and unless someone got the backup targeting system online manually, we would lose that window entirely. I reached Gunnery 3 again, the same station I had saved weeks earlier, and found it worse this time. Half the console melted, smoke curling from a dozen small fires that the automated suppression system had not fully contained. Toma Reyes was there again too, coughing through the smoke, trying to force the backup system to respond. "Voss, it's not responding. I've tried everything. Move." I dropped into the seat and started working, hands moving through wiring still hot from the earlier damage, ignoring the burns forming across my fingers because there was no time to feel them yet. Behind me, through the shattered viewport, I could see the cloaked platform beginning to shimmer back into visibility as its own systems strained under the recharge cycle. 50 seconds until it fires again, I called out. I can't get a lock, Toma said. The targeting computer keeps rejecting the coordinates. Because it's still calculating for the old firing solution. Override it. Feed it the coordinates manually. I'll call them out. I read the numbers from the auxiliary display as fast as I could speak them, watching Toma's hands shake as she input each one, watching the seconds tick down on a clock that felt like it was mocking us. 20 seconds. The platform's shimmer grew brighter, more solid, weapons systems visibly charging along its hull now that its cloak could no longer hide the buildup of energy required to fire. 10 seconds. Almost there, Toma said, voice cracking. 5. Locked. Fire. The Ashvale's remaining guns unleashed everything they had. I watched through the viewport as the platform absorbed the first several impacts, shields flaring violet, and for one terrible second I thought we had failed, that we were about to take a second hit that would finish what the first one started. Then the platform's shields collapsed, and the following impacts tore straight through its hull, and it came apart in a silent, spreading bloom of light and debris. The bridge erupted into relieved chatter, but I did not have time to celebrate. Reactor 2 was still destabilizing, and if it went critical, it would not matter that we had destroyed the platform, because the Ashvale would tear itself apart from the inside. I left Toma at the gunnery station and ran for engineering, meeting Chief Engineer Halvorn Dess in the corridor, his face pale with the specific fear of someone who understood exactly how bad the situation actually was. Reactor 2 is venting radiation into the containment corridor, he said. I need someone to manually seal the secondary containment valve before it fails completely, but the corridor is already lethal without a hazard suit, and we don't have time to get one fitted properly. How much time? Maybe 2 minutes, before the valve fails entirely. Then I'm going in. Voss, that corridor will kill you without proper shielding. Then find me shielding fast, because if that valve fails, it kills everyone on this ship, and I would rather take the risk myself than watch that happen. He found me an emergency radiation suit, thinner than the proper hazard gear, rated for maybe 90 seconds of exposure rather than the full protection I needed, but it was all we had. I pulled it on and moved into the corridor, alarms blaring, warning lights painting everything in a sickly orange glow. The valve control panel sat at the far end, sparking intermittently, radiation levels climbing on the small display built into my suit's wrist. I reached the panel and began working, fingers clumsy inside the thick gloves, every second stretching longer than it should have as I fought with a mechanism never designed to be operated under these conditions. The display on my wrist ticked upward. 60 seconds of exposure. 70. My vision started to blur slightly at the edges, whether from the radiation or simple fear, I could not tell. Voss, get out of there. Dess's voice came through my comm, tight with worry. You're past safe exposure limits. Almost got it. The valve groaned, resisted, and then finally turned under my hands, sealing shut with a hiss of escaping pressure that meant containment had been restored. I stumbled backward out of the corridor, tearing the suit off the moment I crossed the threshold, my skin red and raw where the radiation had bitten through despite the shielding. Medical treated me for radiation exposure over the following hours, along with the burns on my hands from the gunnery console, and I spent that time in the medical bay listening to reports filter in about the convoy, all 3 ships intact, all crew alive, the ambush completely neutralized before it could claim a single life beyond what the Ashvale itself had absorbed. I should have felt proud, part of me did, but mostly I felt tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion, the kind of tired that comes from doing everything right and still wondering if it will ever be enough to matter to the people who decide whether your efforts count. I found out how wrong I was to hope, later that day, when Admiral Threll summoned me to her private ready room. I walked in, expecting, if not gratitude, then at least the professional acknowledgement she usually offered when something had gone well. Instead, I found her standing at the viewport with her back to me, arms crossed, tension radiating off her shoulders in a way I had rarely seen before. "You disobeyed a direct order," she said, without turning around. "During the ambush, I ordered all non-engineering personnel to remain clear of the reactor corridor. You went in anyway." Chief Des needed help, and there wasn't time to wait for a fully qualified engineer to arrive. "That is not your decision to make, Sergeant. With respect, Admiral, if I had waited, the valve would have failed, and we would not be having this conversation right now, because there would be no ship left to have it on." She turned to face me then, and I saw something in her expression I had never seen directed at me before, something sharp and cold that made the air in the room feel heavier. "The Council is already asking questions about why the convoy route was compromised in the first place. They are asking why my ship absorbed a hit meant for civilian vessels. They are asking why my sergeant went outside of protocol not once, but twice, in the same engagement, forcing me to explain decisions I did not make. I was trying to save lives." "You were trying to prove something," she said, voice rising now, sharper than I had ever heard it. "You humans are all the same, always desperate to prove your usefulness, always throwing yourselves into danger as though recklessness were the same thing as courage. Do you understand what it costs me, every single time, to explain to the Council why my ship keeps surviving through the actions of a soldier who cannot follow a simple order?" I stood there, absorbing each word, feeling something inside my chest tighten with every syllable. "I did not ask to be assigned a human sergeant," she continued, and the words came faster now, as though something inside her had finally cracked open after years of careful restraint. "I have tolerated your presence on this ship because Alliance policy requires representation from your species, not because I ever believed you brought anything of real value. You are not clever, Sergeant Voss. You are simply willing to throw your body at problems until they stop being problems, and I am tired of cleaning up the political mess that follows every time you do." The room went very quiet. I do not remember deciding to stay silent. It simply happened, my mouth staying shut while every instinct in my body screamed at me to argue, to list every life saved, every hull breach sealed, every valve closed with hands that trembled from radiation exposure she would never fully understand. But arguing felt pointless in that moment, because I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that nothing I said would change what she had already decided about me years before I ever stepped foot on this ship. "Is there anything else, Admiral?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She studied me for a long moment, something almost like surprise flickering across her features at my calm. Perhaps she had expected an argument. Perhaps some part of her wanted one, wanted permission to dismiss me entirely as just another undisciplined human unable to control his emotions. "No," she said finally. "You're dismissed." I turned and walked out of that ready room without another word, and something inside me, something that had carried me through 7 years of service, through war and ambushes and 100 small indignities I had always managed to swallow, finally, quietly, began to break. I did not go back to my quarters right away. I walked instead through corridors I had walked 1,000 times before, past crew members who nodded at me the way they always did, unaware that anything had changed. I nodded back. I do not remember what my face looked like in that moment, whether it showed anything at all, but I remember feeling strangely disconnected from my own body, as though I were watching myself move through the ship from somewhere just outside my own skin. I ended up in the small chapel room that the Ashvale kept for crew of different faiths and none, a quiet space near the medical bay that most people used only occasionally. It was empty when I arrived, lit by soft amber light meant to feel calming, and I sat down on one of the benches and stared at nothing for a long time. Her words kept replaying in my head, over and over, each repetition finding a new place to cut. You are not clever, you are simply willing to throw your body at problems until they stop being problems. I have tolerated your presence. I never believed you brought anything of real value. I thought about my mother again, the way I had that night 3 weeks earlier after the first breach. She used to say that people show you who they really believe you are, eventually, if you wait long enough and pay close attention. I had waited 7 years. I had paid very close attention, and now I finally understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its brutality, exactly what Admiral Threll believed I was. A tool, something useful only for its willingness to be spent. I thought about every moment I had dismissed as unimportant, every time I told myself that respect would come eventually, that I simply needed to work harder, sacrifice more, prove myself again and again until the proof became undeniable. I had been so certain that persistence was the answer. I understood now that persistence had simply given her more opportunities to use me without ever once considering that I might deserve something in return. I do not know how long I sat there, long enough that the ship's lighting cycled from day into the dimmer tones of simulated evening, long enough that Toma Reyes found me eventually, having apparently gone looking after hearing rumors that something had happened between me and the Admiral. "Voss?" She stood in the doorway, hesitant. "Are you all right? People are saying the Admiral tore into you pretty badly." "I'm fine," I said, which was not true, but felt like the only answer available to me in that moment. She sat down beside me anyway, close enough that I could tell she was worried, far enough that she respected whatever space I needed. "For what it's worth, everyone on gunnery deck knows what you did today, what you've done every time something goes wrong on this ship. Whatever she said, it isn't true." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, even though her words did not undo anything. She left eventually, and I sat alone again, and somewhere in that silence, a decision began forming inside me that felt less like a choice and more like something that had already been decided long before I consciously understood it. I thought about the armor hanging in my quarters, the same armor I had pulled on that morning 3 weeks ago, without a second thought, the way I had pulled it on 1,000 mornings before that. I thought about what it had cost me to wear it. Not in physical terms, though there had been plenty of that, burns and radiation, and the particular exhaustion that comes from constant vigilance. I thought about the deeper cost, the slow erosion of something I had once carried easily and now realized I had been carrying at a steep and unacknowledged price. Every time I put that armor on, I had been telling myself a story about who I was and what I was worth, and the story had been built on the hope that someone, eventually, would see the effort and value it. Admiral Threll had just told me, in words too specific and too deliberate to have been spoken in a moment of simple anger, that she never had and never would. I stood up, finally, and walked back to my quarters with a strange, quiet steadiness in my steps. The room felt different when I entered it, though nothing about it had physically changed. My armor stood on its rack near the door, exactly where I had left it that morning, chest plate catching the low light in a way that had always felt, until now, like looking at something that belonged to me. Tonight it looked like looking at something I had been wearing for someone else's benefit, a costume assembled for an audience that had never once applauded. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at it for a long time. I thought about the war back home, the reason I had joined the Alliance in the first place. I remembered how it had felt to put on armor for the first time, the pride of it, the sense that I was becoming something larger than the frightened young man who had watched his own world nearly burn. I remembered believing that if I served well enough, long enough, with enough sacrifice, I would eventually earn a place among the species who had built this alliance, would eventually stop being seen as an outsider wearing their uniform and start being seen simply as a soldier who belonged. 7 years. Countless engagements, burns and scars, and a body that ached in ways it had not ached when I was younger. And at the end of all of it, a woman I had bled to protect had looked at me and called me nothing more than a body willing to be spent. I stood up and crossed the room to the armor rack. I did not do it in anger. I want to be clear about that, because in the moment, it did not feel like anger at all. It felt like something quieter and heavier, something closer to grief, the particular grief that comes from finally accepting a truth you had spent years refusing to see clearly. I reached up first and unclasped the shoulder guards, the pieces that had absorbed impacts meant to break bone, setting them down on the small table beside my bed with a soft metallic sound that felt unnaturally loud in the silence of the room. Then the gauntlets, the ones that still carried faint burn marks from the console I had repaired with my bare hands only hours earlier. I set them down beside the shoulder guards, arranging them with a strange, deliberate care, as though I were laying out the pieces of someone I used to be. Next came the chest plate, the heaviest piece, the one that had taken the brunt of enemy fire on more occasions than I could easily count. I unclasped it slowly, feeling the weight lift away from my shoulders in a way that felt both physical and something far deeper, a pressure I had carried for so long that its absence felt almost disorienting. I set it down last, standing it upright against the wall, and stepped back to look at the small collection of armor now resting quietly, where it would never again be worn into battle by me. I thought, standing there, about all the people who would say this was the wrong choice. Commander Corrin, who had always treated me fairly, who would likely see this as an overreaction to a single harsh conversation. Toma Reyes, who had just told me the crew respected what I did, who might see this as abandoning the people who counted on me. Even my own mother, whose voice I could still hear clearly in my memory, might have questioned whether walking away solved anything at all, or whether it simply removed me from a place where I could still do good, regardless of whether anyone thanked me for it. But I understood something standing in that quiet room, looking at armor I had worn for 7 years without ever once questioning why I kept putting it on, morning after morning. I understood that there is a difference between sacrifice given freely, out of genuine care for the people around you, and sacrifice extracted from someone who has been convinced, slowly and thoroughly, that their worth is measured entirely by what they are willing to endure. I had been giving Admiral Threll everything I had for 7 years, telling myself it was for the crew, for the mission, for the Alliance itself. And some of that was true. I did care about the people I served with. I cared about Toma Reyes and Chief Des, and even Commander Corrin, whose quiet fairness had meant more to me than she probably realized. But somewhere along the way, I had also been trying to earn something from a woman who had already decided, long before I ever proved anything to her, that I was not worth earning it for. You cannot out-sacrifice someone's contempt. I understood that now, with a clarity that felt almost physical in its weight. No amount of burns, no amount of radiation exposure, no amount of nights spent awake repairing systems that were not my responsibility would ever change a mind that had already closed itself against the possibility of respect. I opened the small storage locker beneath my bed and retrieved my personal effects, the few items I had carried with me from home. A photograph of my mother, faded slightly from age. A small piece of metal, twisted and scorched, that had once been part of my childhood home before the war took it, kept as a reminder of what I had already survived and what I was capable of enduring. I placed these items into a simple bag, along with a change of clothes, moving with the same quiet deliberateness I had used to remove the armor. I did not pack my uniform. I did not pack my rank insignia, the small pin that marked 7 years of service, and had never, not once, been accompanied by a promotion, despite recommendations I later learned Commander Corrin had submitted on my behalf, recommendations that had apparently been quietly rejected without explanation. I left all of it exactly where it sat, arranged neatly on my bed, a clear and silent statement that required no further words. I sat down at the small desk in the corner of my quarters and pulled up a blank message on the terminal, staring at the empty screen for a long moment before I finally began to type. I did not address it to Admiral Threll. I addressed it to Commander Corrin, because she deserved an explanation, and because I trusted her to pass along whatever information was necessary without twisting it into something it was not. I am formally requesting transfer off the ash veil, effective immediately, the message began. I have served this ship and this crew to the best of my ability for 7 years, and I do not regret the time I have given or the people I have come to know during my service. But I have realized tonight that continuing to serve under current command would require me to keep giving pieces of myself to someone who has made clear, in no uncertain terms, that those pieces are neither valued nor wanted beyond their immediate usefulness. I am not leaving because I am angry. I am leaving because I finally understand that walking away is not the same thing as giving up, and that a person can only offer so much of themselves to people who refuse to see what they are offering before something inside them runs out entirely. I thank you for your fairness over these years, Commander. It meant more than you likely realized. Please see that my quarters are cleared for the next assignment, and that my remaining personal effects are handled appropriately. I sent the message before I could second-guess it, watching the small confirmation icon appear on the screen, and then I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for years. The next several hours passed in a strange, quiet blur. I gathered the last of what I needed. I walked one final time through the corridors of the ship that had been my home for 7 years, past the gunnery deck where I had saved lives more times than I could count, past the reactor corridor where my skin still bore faint marks from radiation exposure, past the bridge where Admiral Threll's voice still echoed somewhere in my memory, cold and dismissive and final. I reached the docking bay just as a small transport vessel was preparing to depart for the nearest Alliance station, a routine supply run that happened to be leaving at exactly the right moment. I approached the pilot, a weathered Doruun woman named Elira Vantel, who looked at me with mild curiosity but did not ask questions when I requested passage. "Heading somewhere specific, soldier?" she asked as I climbed aboard. "Not particularly," I said, and found that the answer felt true rather than empty. "Well, plenty of stations along this route, if you change your mind partway through. I appreciate that." She did not press further, and I settled into a seat near the small viewport, watching through the transport's window as the docking bay doors opened and the ash veil grew smaller behind us, a great dark shape against the stars that had been my entire world for 7 years and now felt, strangely, like something I was seeing clearly for the very first time. I did not look back at it with regret. I looked back at it the way a person looks at a chapter of their life that has genuinely ended, with a complicated mixture of gratitude for what it taught me and relief that it was finally, truly, over. Somewhere behind me, on a ship I would likely never set foot on again, Admiral Threll would eventually learn that I was gone. I did not know, in that moment, what she would feel when she found out. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I had walked away for myself, not for any reaction I hoped to provoke in her. But some small, honest part of me wondered anyway. The first sign of trouble aboard the ash veil appeared exactly 9 days after I left, though I did not learn about it until much later, pieced together from messages sent by people who had remained aboard and still thought of me as someone worth writing to. Toma Reyes sent the first message. She kept it short, professional on the surface, but I could read the worry underneath the careful wording. The backup targeting system on Gunnery 3 had failed during a routine drill, the same system I had rewired twice with my own hands under far worse conditions than a drill. No one else on the crew had understood the specific patchwork of repairs I had made, the small adjustments that had kept an aging system functioning long past what its original specifications allowed. The replacement technician sent from engineering had spent 6 hours trying to diagnose a problem I could have fixed in 20 minutes, and even then, the system came back only partially functional. It was a small thing, on its own. Ships lose minor systems all the time, and competent crews adapt. But it was the first thread in a pattern that would continue unraveling over the following weeks, each thread small enough to dismiss individually, significant enough in total that even Admiral Threll would eventually be forced to notice. Chief Engineer Halvorn Dess sent the second message 2 weeks after I left. He wrote plainly, without excessive sentiment, the way engineers often communicate. Reactor 2's containment valve, the one I had sealed with my bare hands during the ambush in the Varen corridor, had developed a slow leak that the automated monitoring systems failed to catch for nearly 18 hours. I had noticed, during my repair, a minor structural weakness in the surrounding housing, something outside the scope of what needed fixing in that emergency moment, and I had made a mental note to report it properly once the crisis passed. In the chaos that followed my departure, that note had never been filed, because I was the only one who had seen the weakness clearly enough to understand its significance. Dess wrote that the leak had been caught before causing serious harm, but that it had required an emergency shutdown of Reactor 2 for nearly 2 full days while his team conducted repairs that took considerably longer without someone who already understood the valve's specific quirks from first-hand experience. He did not blame me for leaving. He simply wanted me to know, he said, that the ship missed things it had not realized it depended on. I read these messages in the small rented room I had taken on Corvell Station, a modest Alliance outpost near the edge of neutral territory, where I had found temporary work helping maintain the station's aging life support systems. It was quiet work, unglamorous, the kind of job that would never earn recognition from anyone important. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not mind this at all. There was a strange peace in doing useful work for people who thanked me simply because it was polite to do so, without any deeper current of resentment or obligation running beneath their gratitude. Commander Corrin sent the third message nearly a month after I left, and this one was longer, more detailed than the others, written in the careful, measured tone she always used even when discussing difficult subjects. She told me that morale aboard the Ashvale had shifted noticeably since my departure. Not dramatically, not in any way that showed up clearly on official reports, but in the small, quiet ways that experienced officers learned to notice. Crew members who had once volunteered readily for difficult assignments now hesitated slightly longer before raising their hands. The easy camaraderie that had existed on gunnery deck, built partly around shared respect for the sergeant who always seemed to know exactly what needed doing before anyone asked, had cooled into something more formal and distant. She wrote that several crew members, including Toma Reyes, had quietly requested transfers of their own, citing reasons that never quite specified the truth, but that Corrin suspected had everything to do with watching how the ship's most reliable soldier had been treated and dismissed after everything he had given it. And then, near the end of her message, Corrin wrote something that surprised me more than anything else in the letter. She told me that Admiral Threll had summoned her to a private meeting shortly after my transfer request went through, asking pointed questions about exactly what had happened between herself and me in the ready room that night. Corrin had not been present for the conversation, but she had heard enough secondhand, from crew members who had noticed my expression walking out of that room, to piece together a reasonable account of what had transpired. She wrote that Threll had asked her, directly, whether she believed I had left because of something the Admiral had said. Corrin had told her the truth, that she believed exactly that. I did not know what to do with this information when I first read it, sitting alone in my small quarters on Corvell Station with the low hum of life support machinery filling the silence around me. Part of me felt a small, uncomfortable satisfaction at the idea that my absence had registered as something more significant than the simple loss of a useful tool. But a larger part of me felt something more complicated, something closer to sadness, because the fact that my departure had caused this much disruption only confirmed how much I had genuinely been holding together during my time aboard that ship, and how little of that effort had ever been acknowledged while I was still there to be thanked for it. Weeks continued to pass. I settled into a rhythm on Corvell Station that felt, for the first time in years, entirely my own. I worked, I ate simple meals in the station's modest dining hall, I spoke with people who knew nothing about my history aboard the Ashvale and simply saw me as a competent, reliable technician who showed up on time and solved problems without complaint. There was a freedom in this anonymity that I had not expected, a lightness that came from no longer measuring my worth against the approval of someone determined never to grant it. I received one more significant message during this period, this one arriving nearly 6 weeks after my departure, and this one came from a source I had not anticipated at all. It was from Ensign Toma Reyes, but it was not addressed to me alone. She had copied several other former crew members from the Ashvale into the message, apparently coordinating something she wanted multiple people to witness together. She wrote that she had, in fact, followed through on her transfer request and had been reassigned to a different vessel entirely, one with a commanding officer who, according to her early impressions, actually took the time to learn the names and specialties of every crew member under their command. But the real substance of her message concerned something that had happened during her final week aboard the Ashvale, something she felt compelled to share before she left the ship for good. Admiral Threll had called a general briefing for the senior crew, ostensibly to discuss updated defense protocols following the Varen Corridor ambush. But partway through the briefing, according to Toma, the Admiral had paused, seemingly unprompted, and addressed the room with an unusual and uncharacteristic admission. Toma reconstructed the moment as best she could remember it. Threll had acknowledged that recent operational difficulties, the failed targeting system, the reactor leak, several smaller incidents that had accumulated over the preceding weeks, could be traced in part to the loss of institutional knowledge that had departed with Sergeant Voss. She had used careful, measured language, the kind designed to acknowledge a problem without fully admitting personal fault, but even in that guarded phrasing, something had clearly shifted. She had said, according to Toma's recollection, that the Alliance's tendency to treat certain crew members as interchangeable resources rather than individuals with irreplaceable expertise was a weakness the fleet as a whole needed to examine more carefully. She had not used my name directly during this portion of the briefing, but everyone in the room, Toma wrote, understood exactly who and what she was referring to. I read this message several times over, sitting on the narrow bed in my small quarters, trying to understand what I felt about it. It was not an apology. It was not even close to one, filtered as it had been through the careful, self-protective language of someone unwilling to fully admit the depth of what she had done. But it was something, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that the ship she commanded had lost something real when I left, and that the loss traced back, at least in part, to choices she herself had made. I did not respond to Toma's message right away. I sat with it instead, letting the information settle, trying to understand whether it changed anything about the choice I had made, or the life I was slowly building on this quiet, unremarkable station, far from the ship that had once felt like my entire world. I concluded, after several days of consideration, that it did not change my choice at all, though it did offer a kind of quiet closure I had not expected to receive. I had not left the Ashvale hoping for this outcome. I had not walked away from Admiral Threll's ready room that night, laid down my armor piece by piece, and boarded a transport vessel into an uncertain future because some part of me calculated that my absence would eventually force a reckoning. I had left because I finally understood that I could not keep giving pieces of myself to someone who had made clear she did not value what she was receiving, regardless of what consequences my absence might or might not create for her afterward. But hearing that the consequences had been real, that my presence and my work had genuinely mattered in ways that became visible only through their absence, offered something I had not realized I still needed. It was not vindication exactly. It was closer to confirmation, a quiet, private acknowledgement that the years I had spent aboard that ship had not been imaginary, that the value I had provided had been real, even when the person receiving it had refused to see it clearly. I finished my shift on the station that evening and walked out to the small observation deck that overlooked the docking bay, watching ships arrive and depart against the vast backdrop of stars. I thought about the ash veil, somewhere out there among countless other vessels, continuing its patrol routes, continuing its mission, continuing without me, in ways both smaller and larger than anyone aboard had probably expected. I thought about Admiral Threll, standing on her bridge, perhaps beginning to understand something about herself and her own assumptions that she had never been forced to examine before. I did not know, standing on that observation deck with the quiet hum of the station around me, whether our paths would ever cross again. I did not know whether time and reflection would change anything meaningful about who she was or how she saw people like me, but I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer needed that question answered in order to feel at peace with the choice I had made. I had laid down my armor because I finally understood my own worth did not depend on her recognition of it, and standing there, watching ships come and go against an endless field of stars, I realized that understanding had not faded in the weeks since I made that choice. If anything, it had only grown steadier, more certain, more completely mine. Whatever came next, whatever path my life took from this quiet station forward, I would walk it standing upright, without armor forged from someone else's approval, carrying only what actually belonged to me. 4 months after I left the ash veil, I was repairing a coolant regulator in the lower maintenance level of Corvell Station when a voice I had not expected to hear again spoke from the doorway behind me. Sergeant Voss. I did not turn around immediately. I recognized the voice before I fully processed what my ears were telling me, and for a strange, suspended moment, I let myself finish tightening the bolt in my hands before setting down my tools and turning to face her. Admiral Threll stood in the corridor entrance, out of uniform for what might have been the first time I had ever seen her, dressed instead in simple traveling clothes that made her look somehow smaller than she had ever appeared on the bridge of her ship. She looked tired in a way I did not remember seeing before, faint shadows beneath her pale eyes, a certain stiffness in her posture that suggested she had traveled a long distance to stand in this particular doorway. "Admiral," I said, "because old habits are difficult to fully abandon, even after everything." "I am not here in an official capacity," she said quickly, as though anticipating my confusion. "I requested personal leave. I came to Corvell Station specifically to find you." I studied her for a moment, trying to read whatever intention lay behind this unexpected visit, and found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, not particularly anxious about the answer. Whatever she had come to say, I understood clearly that it could not undo the choice I had made, could not put the armor back on my shoulders unless I chose to let it, could not diminish the peace I had slowly built for myself over these past months of quiet, unglamorous, honest work. "Would you like to sit?" I asked, gesturing toward a small break room adjacent to the maintenance corridor, more out of basic courtesy than any particular eagerness to extend this conversation. She nodded, and we walked together into the small room, sitting across from each other at a table scarred with the marks of countless previous occupants. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching between us with a weight that felt entirely different from the silences we had shared aboard the ash veil. "I have thought a great deal about what I said to you that night," she began finally, her voice careful, measured, though I could hear something underneath the careful phrasing that suggested this speech had been rehearsed many times before she found the courage to deliver it. I told myself, initially, that I had spoken out of frustration, out of the pressure the council placed on me following the ambush, and that the words themselves did not reflect my genuine assessment of your service. "But you don't believe that anymore," I said, not quite a question. "No," she admitted, "I do not." She looked down at the table for a moment before continuing, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful control, revealing something rawer underneath. "I have commanded human crew members for 11 years, Sergeant. In that time, I convinced myself that I treated all species under my command with equal fairness, that any distance I maintained from my human officers was simply professional caution rather than something deeper and less flattering to examine. Your departure forced me to look at that assumption more honestly than I have ever been willing to before. What did you find when you looked? I found that I had spent 11 years quietly believing humans were valuable, primarily for their willingness to endure hardship, rather than for the intelligence and judgment they brought to every decision they made. I found that I had specifically undervalued your judgment because acknowledging it would have required me to acknowledge that a species my own people have long considered less sophisticated might, in specific and important ways, understand tactical situations more clearly than I did myself. I sat with this admission for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere in my chest. Not quite relief, not quite vindication, something more complicated that I did not yet have words for. "The ambush in the Varen corridor," I said finally. "You didn't believe me, at first, when I flagged the distortion." "No," she said. "I nearly overruled you. I hesitated for several seconds, weighing whether to trust the assessment of a sergeant, whose judgment I had never fully respected, against my own instincts, which told me nothing was wrong. Those seconds could have cost the entire convoy their lives, Sergeant Voss. I have not stopped thinking about that since the night you left. But you did trust me, in the end." I did, barely. And afterward, rather than examining why my trust had come so reluctantly, so close to the margin of disaster, I chose instead to focus on the ways you had exceeded protocol during the crisis that followed. It was easier to be angry about insubordination than to sit with the discomfort of realizing how close I had come to dismissing information that ultimately saved everyone aboard that convoy. I thought about the ready room that night, her voice sharp and cutting, the words that had finally broken something inside me after 7 years of quiet accumulation. I thought about the careful way I had removed my armor afterward, piece by piece, and the strange peace that had followed that decision in the months since. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "What do you want from this conversation, Admiral?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had softened into something I had genuinely never heard from her before, something that sounded almost vulnerable. "I do not entirely know," she admitted. "Part of me hoped, I think, that finding you and offering this explanation might somehow undo the damage of that night, might convince you to return to the ash veil and resume the position you left behind. But sitting here now, listening to myself explain all of this, I understand how presumptuous that hope actually was." "It is presumptuous," I said, not unkindly, but honestly. "You cannot undo 7 years of feeling unseen with a single conversation, however sincere. And I am not certain I want to return to a life built around proving my worth to someone who required a crisis of this magnitude before she was willing to examine her own assumptions." She nodded slowly, absorbing this without argument, and something in her posture suggested she had expected exactly this response, had perhaps even hoped, on some level, for a version of honesty she rarely encountered from the people who served beneath her. "Then let me ask a different question," she said. "Not as your commanding officer, because I understand clearly now that role no longer applies. As someone who has spent 4 months recognizing, slowly and uncomfortably, the extent of what I failed to see for 7 years. What would it take, Sergeant Voss, for you to believe that this recognition is genuine, rather than simply a convenient response to institutional pressure?" I considered this question carefully before answering, because I understood it deserved a considered answer rather than a reflexive one. "Time," I said finally. "Not promises, not a single difficult conversation, however honest it might be in this moment. I would need to see, over months and years, whether this recognition actually changes how you treat the people who serve under you, human and otherwise. Whether the next sergeant who takes an unconventional risk to save lives receives genuine acknowledgement, rather than criticism dressed up as concern for protocol. Whether you extend the same trust to unfamiliar judgment that you extended to me, eventually, during the Varen ambush, but extend it earlier, more readily, without requiring a crisis to force your hand. She absorbed this quietly, and I watched something settle in her expression, a kind of acceptance that seemed to carry both disappointment and, strangely, respect. "That is a fair answer," she said, "more fair than I likely deserve, given how I treated you. I am not interested in punishing you, Admiral. I am simply telling you honestly what genuine change would require, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now." We sat together for a while longer after that, the conversation shifting into quieter territory, less about grievance and more about the practical realities that had unfolded since my departure. She told me, in more detail than Commander Corrin's messages had provided, about the specific difficulties the ship had faced without someone who understood its aging systems as thoroughly as I had come to understand them. She told me that Toma Reyes's transfer had gone through successfully, and that she genuinely hoped the young ensign would thrive under a commanding officer more inclined to nurture her potential than the version of leadership Threll had offered during my time aboard. "I have also," she said, near the end of our conversation, "begun a formal review of promotion recommendations that were previously denied without adequate explanation, including several submitted on your behalf by Commander Corrin over the years." "That won't change anything for me now," I said. "I'm not planning to return to service. I understand that. I am not raising it to change your mind. I am raising it because it seemed important that you know the recommendations existed and that they were genuinely deserved, even though I failed to act on them at the time." I nodded, accepting this small, belated acknowledgement for what it was worth, neither more nor less than an honest attempt at accountability, offered too late to change the past, but perhaps genuinely intended to shape whatever came after. Eventually, she stood to leave, and I walked her back toward the small transport bay where her personal shuttle waited. We paused at the entrance, and she turned to face me one final time, something searching in her expression that suggested she was still not entirely certain how this conversation would settle in her memory once she departed. "For what it is worth," she said, "the ship is not the same without you. I do not say that to guilt you into anything. I say it because it is simply true, and I think you deserve to hear true things from me, even the uncomfortable ones, even now." "Thank you for saying that," I said, and I meant it, even though it did not change my answer about returning. "Will you stay here?" she asked, "on this station, doing work considerably beneath what you are capable of?" I considered the question honestly before answering. For now, yes, I find I like the quiet. I like being valued for exactly what I do, without needing to prove anything larger about my worth as a person, or a representative of my entire species. Maybe eventually I will look for something more, something that uses more of what I learned during my years of service. But I am not in a hurry to rush toward that, not anymore. I spent 7 years rushing toward validation that never fully arrived. I think I am allowed to rest now, for a while, without apologizing for it. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted into what I recognized, perhaps for the first time in our entire acquaintance, as genuine respect, offered freely, rather than extracted through crisis or necessity. "That is a wisdom I did not expect to learn from a sergeant nearly half my age," she said. "I hope, in whatever capacity our paths cross again, that I prove worthy of learning from it." She extended her hand, an unusual gesture for a Keth, whose culture generally favored a slight bow between equals rather than physical contact. I understood the significance of the choice, the deliberate reaching across a boundary she had maintained for 7 years without ever quite acknowledging it existed. I took her hand and shook it, and something in that simple exchange felt like a genuine closing, not of anger or resentment, but of an old chapter finally allowed to rest. She boarded her shuttle and departed shortly afterward, and I stood at the observation window watching her small craft disappear into the vast darkness beyond the station, carrying her back toward a ship and a life I no longer belonged to, at least not in the way I once had. I returned to my quarters that evening and sat for a long while, thinking about everything that had passed between us, weighing the conversation against the months of quiet peace I had built for myself since walking away. I did not feel triumphant exactly. I did not feel that some grand injustice had finally been corrected in a way that erased everything that came before it. But I felt something calmer than triumph, something steadier and more durable. I felt, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, entirely comfortable in my own skin, wearing no armor at all, needing none, because I finally understood that my worth had never actually depended on anyone else's willingness to recognize it. It had been mine all along, earned through every difficult choice I had made, every life I had helped save, every quiet act of care I had extended toward people who mattered to me, regardless of whether anyone in command ever acknowledged the cost. I thought about my mother's words again, the ones I had carried with me since childhood, without ever fully understanding their weight until now. A person's worth was never something you had to prove to people who had already decided not to see it. I understood now, sitting alone in my small quarters on a quiet station far from any battlefield, that walking away had never been an act of weakness or defeat. It had been the first time in 7 years that I had chosen myself, deliberately and without apology, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength no armor had ever given me, a strength that belonged entirely and permanently to who I actually was. Whatever came next, I would carry that strength forward, unarmored and unafraid, into whatever life I chose to build from this point onward. And for the first time, in longer than I could remember, that felt like more than enough.